Hello everyone. So welcome to day 2 of Eco Week. And then today our session is Climate Change 101. So before we kick off, sorry, I'm just admitting people in. 1 second. If I could just get everyone to mute, that'd be great. Beautiful. Perfect. And then if you guys do have any questions in the meantime, we can you can pop up your hand or leave a message in the chat. So just a quick introduction. So my name is Antonia. I am the Young Environmentalist Awards Project Officer. Sorry, 1 second. And I'll basically be your host for today. So if you guys have been involved in any of the other Eco Week presentations, you might have seen me a few times. But I'm just going to tell you a tiny bit about ECO-UNESCO. So ECO-UNESCO was founded in 1986 by a group of young people. And our aim is to empower the young people who are involved with us to help protect the environment. So ECO-UNESCO is proud to be one of UNESCO's affiliated clubs and a Sustainable Development Goals ambassador. So we'll talk a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals throughout this session as well. Then for our session today, which is linked to the SDG 13. So you guys can see all of the 17 SDGs down there. So this one's linked to a climate action. It's just easier and quicker to say SDGs instead of Sustainable Development Goals all the time. So Claudio might say that for you. That's a good segue. So Claudio is our speaker today. So he is the coordinator of our Youth Climate Justice Programme. And basically he facilitates the delivery of the Youth Climate Advocate Justice or Advocate Programme. He can correct me on that one in a second. So if you guys do have any questions, pop up your hand or pop them into the question box. Also, in the meantime, if you could just let us know where you are viewing from and how many of you guys are viewing today so we can get an overall numbers. So I'm going to let Claudio take over from you now.
Hi everyone, thank you very much. Thanks, Antonia. I'm the coordinator of the Youth Climate Justice team and we run the Youth Climate Advocate Program. It's a bit confusing, but basically, we work with my colleague Ziki on climate change and climate justice. So we have kind of a human rights perspective on climate change, and that's something that we're going to touch base during the presentation today. So I'm just gonna try and... Can you see the presentation?
Yep, you are good to go.
Yep.
All good.
Yep, working. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I have to say climate change is my favorite topic. Not as something very not very happy, but it's something that I'm really interested in. I have a background in geography and then I studied climate science at Maynooth University as a master's degree. And I've been involved also in different human rights organizations, so always taking the topic and the issue from a human rights perspective and a social perspective. So we're going to touch base on that. First, I'm going to try and condensate in a few slides what is climate change and why it is an issue that we have to be particularly aware of nowadays. So first of all, can someone pop or just even unmute and say which is weather and which is climate? So which image would you link to weather and which of the photo would you link with climate? Just want to pop even a message into the chat. Antonia can read it. Have any respondents?
Not yet. It's still loading, so we might have one in a second. Weather is on the left, so I guess it depends what your left is.
Okay, I'm gonna assume that left is kind of the Met Éireann kind of map. And yeah, absolutely. So the map is linked to weather, whereas the other picture is linked to climate. So when we talk about weather and climate, we have a couple of distinctions that kind of make it different kind of features, and that's why we talk about climate change and not about weather change. So weather, specifically here in Ireland, I think it's kind of a must topic. I've been here around for 4 or 5 years, and now I understand why people speak about weather every day, because it's it does change a lot during the day. So we can experience different weathers based on the location and the moment. So I'm now based in Dublin 2, but my house is in Dublin 8. So I can bet that you have a difference in the weather here in the city centre of Dublin and in the southern part of Dublin. So, and it changes very rapidly. In 10-15 minutes, you can experience different types of weathers, especially here in Ireland, where you can have all the seasons in just one day. So when we talk about weather, we talk about the climatic conditions in a specific area, in a specific location, in a specific time. Whereas on the other hand, the climate is more kind of linked to the region. So it has an extension in space, which is much wider. So here you have a picture of an arid region. We can see it quite clearly from the features of the vegetation and also from the features of how the person is dressed. And the soil, how it looks like. And then we also have a difference in the time. So we talk about climate, we're not talking about minutes or days, we're talking about centuries. We're talking about thousands of years, we're talking about millions of years. So that's the main difference between weather and climate. So weather, it's just looking out of the window and seeing what's the weather today, how I have to get dressed. Climate is more specific to a wider region, and also it has an extension in time which is much wider. So when we talk about climate, we can do a classification based on the Köppen-Geiger climate classification map. So we can see that different locations throughout the world have different climates. And so we can classify the climates in specific regions based mostly on temperature and quantity of precipitation. And so Ireland is kind of a very light green, and it's common to the British Isles and to part of continental Europe. So we would define it as an Atlantic kind of weather, not a boreal weather. It's kind of more Atlantic. So we have kind of mild temperatures, not freezing temperatures, and then we have a feature of precipitation, which are very intense. If we go south, we see that Europe has different colors. So if we go in Spain or kind of the Mediterranean regions of France and Italy, we see that the colors tend to be more kind of orange and yellow. And so we have kind of a Mediterranean climate. And then we see that if we go maybe in the Saharan desert or in the Arabic Peninsula or in Australia, then we have quite of harsh conditions, which are actually features of an arid kind of desert region. So we have different climatic regions at a global level. So then why do we talk about climate change? We talk about climate change, and this is a visual that is kind of quite intuitive and quite useful. I don't know if you've come across this. These have been realized by Professor Ed Hawkins at the Reading University in the UK with the Met Service in the UK, and these are called the climate stripes. These are used to visualize quite intuitively and quite easily the differences in average temperatures based on a reference period. So here we have a reference period that is 1961, 2010. We use a reference period of usually 3 decades to 5 decades because it makes the information more attainable. And so what we do then is we consider the reference period and we see what is the change, the average change in relation to that reference period. So if we take the last couple of values on the right, which are 2022 and 2023, we see that the red it's extreme. That means obviously that this is a higher temperature change based on the average period of 1961 2010. On the contrary, if we look at the 1880s, we see that there have been some low temperatures based compared to the average 1961 2010. This is particularly, I think, worrying because we see that in the last kind of 2 decades, so starting from the beginning of the 2000s, we see that there's been a constant above average temperature rise if we compare it to the previous decades. So there's been 2003, which can be seen just after the mark of the 2000, which has been a very hot summer in Europe. But that has been just broken. The record has been broken by 2022 and 2023, which also in Ireland have been the hottest years on records. Just to mention, as you can see, the graph goes back to the 1850. There is a reason for this. The reason, if you've studied a bit of history of the 1800 and the 1900, is where actually industrialization begins specifically in the UK. So we have the steam engine, we have massive kind of coal used in the industry and for heating homes. And so it's where actually emissions and carbon emissions start to increase in the air. And we know that because we can analyze levels of carbon particles in ice cores and in trees back to 1850s and also before. We also don't consider before the 1850s because there has been an ice age for a couple of centuries, so it wouldn't be useful to compare the values, today's values, with the ice age in the 1500s and forward. So now we're quite confident that the also Ireland is warming, and so Met Éireann said that in 2023 was the second hottest consecutive year on record, with 1.65 degrees above the average. So if you remember, we came out of the Paris Agreement in 2015, that the world leaders said they were aiming to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, but apparently we are already breaking it. So in 2023, we have 1.6 degrees above average if we compare it to the reference period of 1961-1990. This is my favorite show, just a little bit of physics, not a lot, but it will help us to understand a bit about climate change, what's the origin of climate change and how it affects the atmosphere and it affects the temperatures of the Earth. So try this very quick exercise, cover your mouth and nose and try to breathe 5 times. So you will immediately notice that the air between your hands and your mouth has actually warmed. And it's the same principle that applies when we were wearing masks in public, that we constantly felt that kind of heat and warm air that was kind of pushing in between our mouth, our nose, and our face mask. And it's the same principle of the greenhouse effect. So we have particles of heat that try to escape, but they are trapped in. So when we think about a greenhouse, what's the use of a greenhouse? It helps to grow crops that otherwise we wouldn't be able to grow without a greenhouse for the weather conditions. So the sunlight enters the greenhouse, and so we have radiation energy that comes from the sun into the greenhouse. It penetrates the glass or the plastic, it reaches the leaves, and then we have photosynthesis, and we have then the plants that release heat. So the plants release heat, but that heat gets trapped into the greenhouse. And so we know that if we enter a greenhouse, there are usually always 2 or 3 degrees more, so it's warmer compared to the outside. And so energy comes in, plants convert it, heat comes out, it gets trapped inside the greenhouse. So this process that enables us then to grow tomatoes, lettuce, and other kind of vegetables that maybe we wouldn't be able to grow without a greenhouse. The same principle applies then to the atmosphere. What we have is, I just synthesized the scheme here. We have energy that comes from the sun, that it's expressed in watts per square meter. So we have energy coming in, going into the atmosphere, absorbed by the surface, and then what do we have? We have a release of this energy that it's released in heat. So that release in heat then wants to find a way to escape and to go back into the upper atmosphere, into the upper layers of the atmosphere. But then we have then the greenhouse gases that get into this process. And so mostly what the greenhouse gases do is they link with the particles of heat, and so the heat is trapped inside the lower atmosphere, heating the lower atmosphere. I want to state this clearly: greenhouse gases are not per se negative. Greenhouse gases actually enable life on Earth. Without greenhouse gases, the average temperature of the Earth would be minus 18 degrees, so we wouldn't have life on the planet. So greenhouse gases are actually very important. They're key for enabling life and plants and animals to strive, to grow. They sustain life. But then we have a component, and we will see it in a couple of slides, which are human kind of induced greenhouse gases. So greenhouse gases are essential for life. Otherwise, we would have a temperature of minus 18 degrees and we wouldn't be able to live on the planet Earth. So what are the man kind of induced greenhouse gases? Can anyone kind of pop into the chat or open the mic and think of a greenhouse gas that it's induced, kind of it's produced by humans? Any suggestions? Don't be shy.
We have a few there. So we've methane, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, water vapor. So they're all from Delore Davis.
Amazing. Absolutely. Yeah, you nailed them. So we covered them all. Thank you very much for the replies. So we have CO2 and CH4, kind of carbon dioxide and methane, which are kind of the most famous ones for, especially when we talk about CO2 levels, methane levels, part per millions into the atmosphere, and linking it with the rise in global temperatures. But then we have H2O. So the most common actually greenhouse gas is water vapor. It is common, but it doesn't produce an effect. It's not so damaging for the atmosphere as the other ones because it has a very short life into the atmosphere. So the particles of heat aren't able to link and to bond quickly enough with H2O because it decays very quickly. On the other hand, CO2 and CH4 especially, they have a lifespan into the atmosphere of decades. And so that's why they are particularly important when we talk about greenhouse gases and climate change. And then we have other kind of nitrous oxide and other kind of fluorinated gases, which are also considered greenhouse gases emitted and produced by humans. So as I said, what happens is very basically is we have the particles of heat. So we have heat that link to the greenhouse gases. They don't exit, they don't go out of the lower layers of the atmosphere. So they keep in, and then we have a rise in global temperatures because the heat stays into the lower atmosphere. And so basically we produce a greenhouse effect. So mentioning carbon dioxide, we see that there is proof and has been proven in the last years that there is a correlation between the rise in temperature at a global level and an increase in the emissions of carbon dioxide. So this is usually expressed in parts per million. So how many parts of carbon dioxide per million we find into the atmosphere. And so you can see there's been a huge surge in parts per million of carbon dioxide starting from the industrialization at the mid 1800, and that is to be linked also with an increase in global temperature at a global level. You can see it's not immediate. It doesn't mean that if you emit CO2 today, you will have an increase in temperature. Usually it takes years also for the particles to decay. So even if we stop emitting CO2 now, we will have the effects of emissions, of global emissions of greenhouse gases in the next years and in the next decades. Not something that if we halt it now, we will have a decrease in global temperatures at the global level immediately. It will take years for the Earth to find a balance and to kind of re-find a balance that is sustainable. So talking about the impacts of climate change, it's useful, I think, to talk about the tragedy of the commons as well, because we have to think of the Earth and of natural resources as kind of a common, something that we have, that it's available, but it has also a capacity to sustain us. But then the overusing and the exploitation of that capacity then brings to the tragedy of the commons. So if I have a land patchment of, here in the examples, you have 16 hectares, and I know I have a carrying capacity of 20 cows. If I increase and increase and increase the number of cows on the same kind of amount of land, then it will have a depletion of the resource. And that's basically the same principle that we can apply to modern kind of industrialization, and it's leading to the depletion of natural resources and to climate change. So we know that then the Earth has to the Earth finds a balance, a new balance, and that balance then has effects on the climate and then has impacts on the livelihoods of people. But it all starts with the depletion of resources, or if I can say, with greed, and if kind of the push for developing an exploitation of resources, and that leads to the depletion of the environment, and then to the impacts of climate change. So when we talk about the impacts of climate change, I'll try to cover this quite quickly. I brought you a couple of images. So the one on top is a comparison of beach in Courtdown in County Wicklow near Gorey. So the image on the left shows the beach in the at the end of the 1900s, and then you have an image that I took last year when I was down doing a research trip with Maynooth University. So you see there is a huge change. So once this was a beach where people could actually enjoy free time, they would stay there, they would have leisure activities, things that normally you would do on a beach, especially in the summer. And then you have an image of today, and you see that erosion and sea level rise has completely changed the same exact stretch of land. I mean, you can recognize the same stretch of land with the dunes, but then you can see that this is not anymore a stretch of land of beach that can be used for leisure and spending time and human activities. You basically just have rocks that have been put there to even prevent even more coastal erosion. Down then on the bottom left, you have a flood image. So this has been taken recently in Italy, my country, a region of Italy in the center north. It's called Emilia-Romagna. It's been the second consecutive year that we have massive floods in this area of Italy. So usually these are floods that would happen every 100 years, and we had two floods, May 2023, September 2024, 2 consecutive years. So the occurrence of a 100 years event in 2 consecutive years means that something's going on, means that the system isn't balanced anymore. And then you have the image of massive, wildfires in Brazil. So often you hear people that say that wildfires are not linked with climate change, but climate change actually prepares the fuel for wildfires. Because if you have a decrease in the amounts of rainfall, especially in an area where usually it rains a lot, like Brazil, like the Amazon forest, and then you have a rise also in temperatures for months or weeks, that prepares, it's a combustion for wildfires. And these massive wildfires can also be induced by men that want to clear kind of land for farming or cattle. But on the other hand, they can also be just induced by the weather conditions. And so these are kind of the impacts of climate change. Just very briefly, I think coastal erosion is something that is very kind of understandable, and it's something that is occurring also here in Ireland, especially in the east. So in this kind of area with Dublin and the counties south of County Dublin, you have a lot of coastal erosion going on, and you have huge impacts on people living there. And that's something that has to be kind of considered, and also the rise in sea level at also around the coast of Ireland. On the other hand, then you have the impacts by massive flooding. Now, countries like Italy, which were not kind of exposed to kind of these type of floods, now see that areas, towns, cities get flooded and stay flooded for weeks. It takes weeks for actually the soil to absorb this huge amount of rainfall that falls maybe in just 6 or 8 hours, and it's the same amount that should actually be falling in 1 month. So there is a limited capacity for the land to absorb, and then you have damages to infrastructure, to people, to livelihoods. It's something that has also happened in other areas of Europe now with Storm Boris that has hit the Czech Republic, Austria, and other countries. And then obviously, the images of wildfires in Brazil that have been also captured by satellites gives us an extent of how actually wide the situation and the problem is. So let's debunk a couple of myths about climate change. I think it's very important because we still hear them. There are kind of constantly, elections going on throughout the world. There are some very important one approaching in the next couple of months. We've had European elections in June, and so every time, I think climate change is an issue. It's not it's not talked about enough. And then you still hear, after, I mean, years and years of science that has proven that climate change is actually induced and it's man-made, you still hear a bit of myths and fake news going along. So the first one, climate change has always happened, so we should not worry about it. It's true to a certain extent. I mean, there has always been, I mean, changes in the system. If we think about dinosaurs, I mean, millions of years ago, the global temperature was definitely warmer compared to now. And then we have some natural changes at an Earth level. So we have the cycles of Milankovitch, for example, which bring a change in the temperatures at the global level. But these kind of processes are very, very slow in time. The kind of the unique feature of climate change now is the amount of change in such a short time. So in 150 years, we had a change of over 1.4 degrees Celsius at the global level. That's not something natural. It's not occurring naturally. It's something that is induced and produced by human activity. Second hand, so climate change is a natural process. It has nothing to do with people. So as I showed you in one of these slides, there is a correlation between global temperature rise and global emissions of CO2 and methane and other kind of human gases, artificial gases. And also, I mean, there have been one of the things also you hear a bit about in the news is usually that volcanoes also emit, but volcanoes account actually for a very, very small amount of greenhouse gases, and volcanoes actually react in a different way. If there is a big eruption, a massive eruption at the global level, volcanoes would actually cool down the temperatures. Why? Because the fumes, the dust, the debris that they actually that these massive, I mean, eruptions, if you think of Indonesia and the Iceland, they would actually cool the surface, because they would actually prevent solar beams and so solar energy to enter the atmosphere. So actually volcano eruptions contribute to cooling the atmosphere for a certain amount of time. A couple of degrees of warming is not that big of a deal. It is a big deal. If we've seen that if we don't meet the target of staying below 2 degrees Celsius, we would have massive coral kind of bleaching, and 90% of coral will die at a global level, because we have oceans that are the most important carbon sink that won't be able to capture carbon anymore, and so there would be a release in the atmosphere of even more greenhouse gases, leading to kind of even a more increase of CO2 and of temperatures at a global level. So actually, even 1 degree, even 0.5 degrees of difference in temperature change, in degrees of warming, is actually significant. An increase in cold snaps shows climate change is not real. We've heard this. We've had snow in Ireland last year in February. We were all very happy. We were playing in the streets and in the park. We had very kind of cold events in North America, Canada, and the US, covered in meters of snow. But that actually is linked with climate change, because we have Arctic air coming from the north that infiltrates subarctic regions due to climate change. So actually that proves even more that climate change is happening, because the jet stream weakens, and then you have these kind of incursions of very cold Arctic air from the Arctic regions into kind of subarctic and boreal regions. So that's something that actually proves that climate change is happening. We don't need to worry about lowering greenhouse gas emissions. Humanity is inventive. We can just adapt to climate change. So there's been a lot of discussion, and there's still discussion on how you can actually capture carbon, how you can actually kind of adapt to increase in carbon emissions, planting trees and so on. There's no way of adapting in this way to climate change. The only way in which we can prevent even more kind of effects and impacts of climate change in the next decades and centuries is by lowering and actually halting greenhouse gas emissions at a global level. So carbon capture is extremely expensive. it's very difficult to implement this at a global scale. And it requires a development in technology that at this moment, at this time, we do not have. Scientists disagree on the causes of climate change. There's no disagreement. The IPCC AR6 that was completed in 2023, which puts together the up-to-date science on climate change, both physically, on the human side, impacts, adaptation, mitigation, states very clearly that climate change is caused by humans, by human activity, by emissions of greenhouse gases, which I said are not per se negative, but the amount of emissions and the amount of concentration that we actually cause to be into the atmosphere is causing climate change. So there's no doubt in the scientific community, in the relevant scientific community, that climate change is caused, that current climate change is caused by human activities. And now we want to go a bit on the kind of the human perspective, which is something that we as the climate justice team do, is kind of not just focusing on the science, on the physical aspect of climate change, but see how actually climate change impacts people at a global level, at a local level. So climate change affects people. We are all affected by climate change. My family that lives in Italy, they've experienced an extremely hot summer now for the past 2 years, with temperatures that have been for many days in Rome over 40 degrees, over 30 degrees, even at night. So literally we call them tropical nights when the temperature doesn't drop below 20 degrees, and that causes some serious health issues as well. So climate change impacts people differently depending on different factors. I just put some of these here. So location. So we are impacted by climate change differently. Even here in Ireland, if you live in Dublin, you will have certain impacts of climate change. If you live along the coast of Galway, of Cortown, where I showed you, you will be impacted by climate change differently. If you live in the northwest, you will be impacted by climate change even differently, because there you have storms, increase in storms throughout the year. Income definitely has a huge kind of plays a huge role in this. I mean, if you have to imagine, I mean, in Italy now, most people have to fit air conditioning into their homes, and so income plays a huge role in this. Also here in Ireland, maybe in the next decade, we will have to fit as well air conditioning because summers will get warmer, and so income is something that plays a role. We have to consider if people can afford adaptation kind of strategies within their lives, and how they can sustain this. Gender, especially in developing countries, where women are impacted differently, especially if they work, if they're out of school, if they are not into education, how they're impacted by climate change differs a lot from how men are impacted by climate change. So class links a lot with income, and so and then we have the race or ethnicity. If we think even of segregation in countries, like examples, I mean, in the US, in South Africa, where people, communities live segregated, and where you have segregation based on ethnicity, and specifically, I mean, most times you have segregation that makes people being less, have less means in segregated communities and segregated areas. If we think of Hurricane Katrina, how that impacted people differently based on race and ethnicity in Pennsylvania and Louisiana. And then we have age. I mean, people are impacted differently also based on their age. We think of elder people in many countries, which will have to seek support by family members, or will have to seek support by local authorities or sustain groups or things like this. And then we have level of education. So education plays a key role. Just even being here, taking part to this talk or to other talks throughout the week on different SDGs, enables you to acquire tools for understanding climate change, for understanding what's going on, and to try to think also yourself at possible adaptation mechanism and how to deal with the situation. And then we have other personal characteristics, which can be disability or other characteristics and see how these also play kind of a role in how we are impacted differently by climate change. So which human rights do you think are impacted by climate change? So if we think of human rights at a kind of a holistic perspective, if you want to pop into the chat a couple of examples of how you think or which human rights in your idea, even for yourself, would be impacted by climate change. I don't know, Antonio, if we have any suggestion or...
I think people might be a bit shy, but I think we have one maybe coming in.
Yeah.
Maybe you can give them a bit of a hint. So one of them is the right to food and housing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much. So many different human rights. I mean, and human rights are kind of all interlinked. There isn't like one human right above others. So I just put some of the examples of human rights that can be and are impacted by climate change. So definitely the right to food is impacted. I mean, we have in the Horn of Africa, we have harvest that has been below average now for many years. And so there's food scarcity in many kind of areas in the African region. We have the right to housing, which then can impact other human rights like the right to education or the right to water and sanitation. We have the right to life, which is definitely impacted by climate change. We have the right to well-being, health and well-being. We have the right to non-discrimination. If we think especially of people that are brought to flee their homes, they are internally displaced, so they become refugees. How these can be discriminated in communities, and so the right to non-discrimination. And then we have the right to self-determination. So if we have a lack of, or we have a human rights violation, then we're not able to enjoy the right of self-determination ourselves. So this is just an example. I mean, if you get the Human Rights Declaration, you will see that all human rights are impacted. The right to work, the right to education are all impacted by climate change on a different extent. I am aware that we are running a bit late. I mean, there is also time for questions, so I'm just going to briefly touch on this. I mean, for us, climate justice means also recognizing the work of human rights defenders, of environmental human rights defenders, and climate justice advocates at a global level. So I think you all know Greta Thunberg. She started the Fridays for Future movement. The other activists, I think, maybe not so famous for you. You maybe haven't heard them, but they really have played a key role in environmental awareness in their communities and also at a global level. So next to Greta, we have a South African activist, Nolin Butuma. She's been defending their lands and the environment in South Africa against mining companies that wanted to implement offshore mining and drilling project exploiting the environment both offshore and onshore. Then we have Chico Mendes, one of the first actually climate activists, worldly kind of famous. He lost his life for his work and for his fight. He's defended the Amazon in Brazil. Then we have Ken Saro-Wiwa, which has been fighting against the Shell, so the oil corporation, the Dutch oil corporation in the Delta Niger. Then Shell has been brought to court and has found accountable of massive environmental degradation in an area which was inhabited by the Ogoni indigenous people in the delta of the Niger, which was a beautiful area. Now it's vastly and severely polluted, and so you have huge kind of massive degradation of the land due to this. And then you have Berta Cáceres. She's been fighting and she lost her life for this in Honduras. She's and now her daughter Berta Zuniga is continuing the fight for protecting the land and the indigenous communities in the Honduras area forest. So what you can do, I mean, Huge things, both at a personal level and as a group. You can definitely, being here, educating yourself is absolutely important. You can vote if you have right to vote, join a protest, spread the word, create events and webinars to educate friends and community, especially, around November, where there would be the COP, the Conference of the Parties in Azerbaijan, in Baku. That's a very good time for kind of making politicians and representatives feel the pressure of communities and just citizenship and citizens on climate change and climate justice. Do an action project. I hope Antonia is going to leave you the link to the Youth Climate Advocate program, where we kind of support you in developing your climate justice and climate change action project. These are just ideas. You can have, you can create a podcast, you can track objects and see where kind of the dumped fast fashion end up to, or you can also create a garden and name some of the trees to human rights defenders that have dedicated their life to this. Just also leaving a bit of links and useful tools that you can use in your class and in your kind of work. I think we can maybe leave it to the questions, Antonia, if there are any.
Yeah, perfect. So Paula's just popped in asking for access to the slides. So we can try to do that later on. Paula, I know you emailed me. So I'll try give you access to most of the slides maybe later on in the week if that's easier for you. If anyone else does have any questions, just pop them in or raise your hand, and whatever is easiest. But in the meantime, I'm just going to share my screen really quick, because I know we're a little bit tight for time. But if anyone does have any questions, Claudio is still there, so he can answer the questions while they come in. So as he mentioned, I have put in the Youth for Climate Advocacy Program link. I can link it again for you guys. So if you were to get involved, there's several different avenues you can get involved with ECO-UNESCO itself as an organisation. So we have our Young Environmentalist Awards, that's what I work on. So it's having that eco action project and then getting it over the line and entering it in and seeing how we can raise awareness through all of these different projects. And they're all in line with the SDGs as well. Then we have our workshops, so they can come to your school or they can be online, and they have a vast array of different types of workshops that can be catered towards you. And then we have our youth groups, so that's where Claudio comes in and Ziki comes in. So these guys will run the climate justice program, so you can get involved in that way. Or our Youth for Sustainable Development, so that is a 12-week program. It's online, or it can be in person in certain areas. So in Maynooth, Galway, Drogheda and Dublin is where it's in person. I'm going to fly through this, but if you guys do have any feedback, let me know. It's great to get feedback, especially on these sessions, because this year we've changed it up a little bit, running it in line with SDG week. So it's really, really good to get any feedback you have. I have pinned that in the chat, but I'm just going to share Claudio's link again. So that's just for the Youth Climate Action or Advocate Program, apologies. So if Claudio, we have a couple of minutes, so if you want to chat more about that, you can. Otherwise, thank you guys for tuning in, and hopefully we will see you for the rest of the week. I'll pop this back up. So for the rest of the week, we still have Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to come, and it's all still on Eventbrite, so you can still sign up if needed, or you can sign up on the day. But thank you so much to everyone, and I will try share the slides with you, Paula, as soon as possible. And I'll also try get the slides from earlier as well. But once again, send me an email as a quick reminder, just in case I forget. But thank you guys, and thank you, Claudio.
Yeah,
that was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, if there aren't any questions, just feel free to pop into the registration or send us an email with the Youth Climate Advocate Program. We are running it online and in person in Dublin. We're working on climate justice, climate action projects, and we're kind of getting involved, young people in their communities to raise their voice for climate change and climate justice. And also then you can enter the Young Environmentalist Awards as well later on in 2025.
Claudio, do you have an email if you just want to pop your email into the chat as well?
Absolutely,
just in case.
Yep.
Yeah, because people can get access to this later on then as well. And if you guys do have any further questions, I myself might not be able to answer, but Claudia or Ziki will 100% be able to answer them for you. But if you have any questions in the meantime as well, we also have our info@eco-unesco.ie available, and it is all online, so you can catch us there. But thank you so much, guys. See you.
Yeah. Thanks a million.
Bye.
Bye now. Bye-bye.
Bye.